because I know you're probably wondering, what is a marketing person doing kicking off this conference, right? All things open. And if I were you, I'd have exactly the same question. The reality, though, is I've only just recently became CMO at Red Hat. I've been 37 years in the software industry. I'm sort of the living history lesson for what really happened at the beginning of open source, long before it was called that. So what I wanted to do today is just take you back and look at how we got here. I mean, look at this room, right? 3,300 people. You look at the state of open source now, beyond just technology, into methodology, into culture changes, impacting all manner of human endeavor. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. But I thought it'd be worth giving a little bit of a irreverent perspective on how we got here, and that's what I'd like to do in a very short period of time today. So the way we're going to start is just by reminding you how much open source is around us every single day, how much we're interacting with open source. So the crack video team at Red Hat took a team to document a week in the life of one of our hard-charging, no-nonsense executives as they were preparing for a major business trip to Asia. And we actually started first looking at getting ready by getting an early morning, double espresso at Starbucks. Starbucks, as it turns out, has done major work in automation using open source. They have an open agronomy project, which is all about how to share best practices around growing beans and those sorts of things. So, and the morning of that trip, that hard-charging executive went to get his double espresso. Or maybe a fruity drink and a selfie. So next thing, had to get something to eat. By the way, the documentary team was my wife and daughter, so I should just admit that up front. So next we went to Chili's to grab, just a healthy snack. And Chili's, as it turns out, and Brinker's, the parent company for Chili's and Maggiano's, the entire customer digital experience that you see, from the web to the restaurants themselves and the little kiosks that they have at the desk, all open source. So pretty extraordinary. So you're getting ready for that trip, eating healthy, just having a little nosh. Okay, maybe it was ribs and margaritas. Unlike Starbucks, this was not breakfast. So this was later in the day. Next up, had to get some supplies. I was a little low on office supplies, going to work the whole flight to Japan. So I made a little trip to Target. Target's really interesting. I was very fortunate, actually, true story, to co-keynote a Gartner conference with Elwin Loomis, who was the chief architect that drove Target's entire digital transformation. Amazing story, going from 1,800 brick and mortar stores to a full-on digital property today. And so I just went to get some office supplies and maybe some snacks too for the plane. By the way, if you ever actually try to ride one of these, when you put them in reverse, it's like 120 decibel beep and everybody looks at you. So trying to be discreet and not getting caught taking this picture didn't work. So that was Target. So now it's time to travel. I personally fly United, just have all my life. But every major airline in the Fortune 500, in fact, uses open source every day, from the electronic systems to infotainment and the like. So I plan to do a whole trip just getting some work done. And maybe a couple glasses of wine. I had to take a little nap in between. So, but can I ask anybody a question? Somebody asked me this before and look at his pictures. Does the fellow to the next to me look like an air marshal to anybody? Because he never said a word, he never drank, and he never slept. So I was a little suspicious, but the tip-off was when he dragged me off the plane after taking this picture. Then I knew. So, all right. So let's get a little serious and talk about how we got here. So open source has been around in some form or another since long before the term was coined in 1998. And I was fortunate in my career to have gone through, I came up through the ranks in UNIX and distributed computing, and I'd just like to give you some of the perspective that I have and how it relates to how we got here in this room today. But we'll do it in a slightly irreverent way, not that we haven't been doing that already, but just sort of give you some of the interesting anecdotes and sort of sidebars that you don't see in all the books. Okay, maybe I went back a little too early in history. I think this was my first marketing job, actually. So let's look at a little bit more of the history. So let's start with 1989. I had already been working for a Digital Equipment Corporation, was since bought by Compaq, and Compaq since by HP. But DEC, as it was known, was a technology tour de force. I grew up in product management. And what was interesting about DEC and its roots were in open collaboration at MIT. A lot of the leadership team came from MIT doing the first generation of computers. We just worked hand in glove with MIT, and particularly I was on, ultimately in 1989, I went to the UNIX group to run product management, product marketing, and it was just a matter of course. We were working on numerous projects with MIT, with other universities, and by virtue of the MIT Media Lab, with other competitors. So we had actually had just as a matter of course, a rhythm in terms of how to collaborate, typically through universities initially, with other companies. That was one interesting, and I progressed through the ranks. I wound up being vice president and GM of basically Unix, all their system software, networking. So I got a pretty good perspective, and was actually part of championing efforts that were happening around standardization and motif and things that were happening in distributed computing technologies at the time, like DCE. The other interesting thing about that team at Digital is the folks that invented Red Hat Enterprise Linux were in my group in that day. So folks that you may know, like Brian Stevens and Tim Burke, they were the two guys that actually wrote the first version of Enterprise Linux in Tim Burke's garage. And here we are today, into our 7th major release, built an extraordinary company. So I was starting to see the good side of collaboration and particularly leveraging the work I was going to MIT. I mentioned I then became vice president and general manager right at the time that what we referred to in those days as the Unix wars were playing out. Started with AT&T suing Berkeley over the Berkeley standard distribution. And so everybody factionalized, right? So all the companies that were productizing a Unix variant, my team was productizing first a BSD distribution and then eventually Mach microkernel from Carnegie Mellon, which was still BSD licensed. And others were on System 5, and it just created chaos. There were competing foundations built, but everybody knew it was dooming us. Like every vendor team, in fact, we'd go through these cycles of creating yet a new forum to try to rationalize these things, and you can look back in history and some of these things, cozy, common open software environment, Spec 1170. There was really an attempt to standardize 1,170 APIs in the operating system, so you could get a high degree of source and binary compatibility. They all failed. But it was at the time where other open source licenses were starting to come on the scene, other ways to collaborate. So it wasn't for want of trying. We just weren't figuring it out in this point. Eventually, I wound up at Compaq. Compaq was acquired DEC, and in 1998, I was responsible for all the enterprise software elements of their business. And this was a time where Unix had fundamentally lost the mid-tier. We had focused ours totally on a 64-bit high-end platform. So my job was to figure out how we balanced our requirements in the mid-market. And Windows NT was really the only other alternative, so I started to look for other things that might be an effective alternative. And I knew all these folks that had gone to a company called Red Hat, and they were working on Linux. And I got really intrigued about the possibility of Linux being a mid-tier alternative to being totally dependent on Windows NT as a company. And so I reached out, got to know Bob Young, who was the founder, of course, Matthew Zulik at the time, and I actually led Compaq's strategic equity investment in Red Hat pre-IPO. So I knew Red Hat when it was 60 people and very little money, and I can remember I had to go to Compaq's board of directors to present why I wanted to do this, and Ben Rosen, who was one of the world's first venture capitalists, he was the chairman of the board at Compaq, I got all done making my pitch why this is so strategically important. And he literally said to me, gee, Tim, this all sounds interesting, but they just sell free software, right? And how many times have you heard that in your lives, right? He was the first one who asked me. He said, well, how do they make money? And I said, gee, I don't really know, but they sell a lot of hats, pens, and T-shirts. So I think that's the business model of the future, which is why Ben Rosen was a venture capitalist and why I'm still working for a living. At any rate, so that was a pretty interesting time because I got to see the amazing things that started to play out around Red Hat and then Enterprise Linux. In the middle of that, I went to a company called Alaire. Alaire, Cold Fusion, if you see .cfms on the web, those are Cold Fusion web pages. We really was the world's first app server. And then we acquired a company called JRun, which was our first J2E app server. So I became very engaged in the whole Java community, what was happening with the JE spec. Actually met a fellow where we were trying to do a collaboration from Bluestone named Bob Bickel. Bob went on to become CTO of JBoss. So in that time frame, Red Hat Enterprise Linux was released, sort of changed the game pretty dramatically and pretty quickly. I got so excited that I wound up coming to Red Hat several years later in 2005 as what amounted to be our first chief marketing officer, although at that time, all the businesses and product lines and everything were in that role, so I was still doing basically product management. But one of the things I learned coming in was we lacked a middleware strategy, but really needed to build one. So we needed to expand beyond our pure platform base. So right away, I started to champion the cause of expanding from what fledgling things the company was doing to acquiring JBoss, which we did. And in fact, this picture is a few months after the acquisition of JBoss. We acquired them for $350 million. At the time, on the very left of your screen is our general counsel, Michael Cunningham. The gentleman next to him is Mark Fleury, who was the founder and CEO of JBoss. Mark, as you see in this picture, is trying to hip check Michael off the podium. Apparently, $350 million may not have been enough, but it was a pretty interesting time, and that was an extraordinary acquisition in the open source space in the day. And it's gone on to be a successful business for us. So just moving forward a little bit, I'd been a CEO once before, and I got the itch to go do it again. And the company I went to work for was a company called Black Duck Software. And I was always intrigued by them. Red Hat was an investor, right? I mean, this is a small world story if there ever was one. So I was intrigued by the company, not because of what they were doing, but because of the technology they had built. They were doing automated open source license compliance, but I always thought that if you applied that capability far upstream in the development process and used it to drive adoption and enablement, that would be a much more powerful story. And so fundamentally, I went to the company to do that pivot, and it was awesome. And in fact, over the course of those years, we wound up having incredible conversations with customers who were now starting to think about not just using open source technology in development, which we were trying to enable, but also how to apply open source style development methods to what they were doing internally, open source processes. How do you even bring open source culture into bear and apply it internally? What I think Jim Gielski is going to talk about in terms of inner sourcing, right? This was inner sourcing, and it still is today. The notion of companies bringing open source technologies and methods and culture inside to make themselves more agile as part of their agile development process. So I got a deep exposure to that from 2009 to when I came back to Red Hat in 2014. Talked to more CIOs about how they could change their development environments and cultures than any time in my history. So now I have sort of a full notion of how powerful this can be. Came back to Red Hat in 2014, did a couple of acquisitions, and the company was screaming because now we're serving multiple capabilities, but we're also having these conversations with customers and potential customers around how their cultures can evolve and how they can take advantage of open, not just in open source software and licensing, but in this much broader dimension. And in that time frame, Red Hat screamed to be a $2 billion company. And I had been there for a couple years. Coincidence? I don't know. Only the Red Hatters laughed at that. All right. And then in 2017, a couple things happened. We made it to the Global 2000, so Red Hat is a Global 2000 company now. And I was asked by Jim Whitehurst to step into the marketing role. And I was extremely excited because I think this is a role in a company from which we can really evangelize open source as a movement. as a way of collaborating that transcends software, transcends technologies, but has a major potential to have real cultural impact. And that was fundamentally why I said yes to this role. Although I will tell you, my technical colleagues in Red Hat all of a sudden treated me like I dropped 20 IQ points when I made that job change. Okay, one last quick slide, metaphorically. This is taken at a conference in China, an open source conference in China. I've been very fortunate to work with some of the best minds in open source. Many of them are still here today. In this picture, you can see Dirk Hondel, you can see Jim Zemlin, Mark Shuttleworth's next to me. But there's many. I don't have the time to go through them all. But it's been extraordinary to work with them and looking in this past. And I sort of see myself as like the Forrest Gump of open source. I wound up at all these really interesting points in history. But I'm not really sure why. But that's all I got to say about that. Okay, so I'm a little behind, so I'm going to go very quickly just on where we are today. Open source is everywhere. Mark Driver at Gartner, 95% of companies, non-trivial use of open source, which I guess means the other 5 use trivial open source, but it's still a pretty significant statistic no matter what. And its use is growing, growing pretty dramatically in all companies, even the ones that don't know they're using it. So just some statistics, it transcends apps, it transcends app development, infrastructure, networking, you name it. And it's becoming part of how companies do business. Whether or not they're technology companies, they're participating more and more in these communities. And so open source itself has become the font of virtually all original innovation in software. It moved from early days when I started, creating low-cost replicas of commercial software, to now being the heart of how technology is innovated. But it's more than just technology. It's how processes and collaboration and culture are innovated too. And as I said, it's starting to transcend all manner of human endeavor well beyond just technology. So one or two last points. Look at where we are today and how open source is impacting things like artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, immersive experiences, virtual reality, augmented reality, the range of digital platforms that we're able to engage on. And now it's starting to impact other elements of humanity, like healthcare, like agriculture, like education, like art. And in fact, if we can pull this off, just like to show you a very short video of how open source is being applied to the arts. Must be playing off of my lavalier mic, I guess. All right, well, let's see. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip that. The story is about Tate Modern, the museum, the very famous museum in London. They actually have an exhibit now where there's nothing in the room except tables and chairs and a piece of paper to suggest a topic that people might collaborate on. And just attendees to the museum sit down and start talking, and here you go.
All I walk around is just seeing people on their phones, head downs. They're not talking to no one. You can't even get a smile from anybody.
This is the commodity that we're losing out on. Time and space, real human exchange is getting sidelined.
When people first come into the Tate Exchange, they look lost. They say, I don't know where to go, don't know what to do.
And I came here I had no idea what to expect.
We were introduced by a woman in the door, and we say what's going on, and she say just come in for 5 minutes.
And I had a look around, and there was a table with some people, so I joined it.
People want a space where they can be more active, more part of something. I really didn't know if it was enough.
This is an experiment of, would people do it? Would they come and sit down at this table? Would they give of themselves?
People can get to know each other in a new way. Going to the unknown, it takes the form of an ordinary wooden table.
Okay, so just to wrap up here, out of time, but I wanted to end by thanking all of you. So this is a corner of the industry that I've spent my complete professional life in, 37 years. We've got something amazing going on here. It's now impacting, as I said, healthcare, agriculture, you name it, emergency responses in hurricanes and earthquakes. So we've got a movement that's tremendous right now, 3,300 people here today. You're the leaders of the current generation and going forward. So I wanted to first thank you for allowing me to speak a little bit today, hopefully got you woken up. But more importantly, I want to thank you for what you're doing in terms of leading open source, be it in technology, all the way out to the other human endeavors. And hopefully this is a conference that can come to represent that over the next years. So with that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Tim.